Time, in its unyielding advance, inscribes its journey onto the human frame. It carves deeper furrows around eyes that have witnessed both joy and anguish, it laces the hair with strands of silver born of worry or wisdom, and it gently remolds the features of a face, inscribing each passing year with an undeniable, visible truth. We are all, each one of us, living chronicles of our own existence. Our bodies stand as proof of the seasons we have endured, the experiences we have accumulated. But try, if you are able, to envision a face that resists this elemental rule of nature. A countenance held still, locked in a perpetual springtime while the world around it hastens headlong into decay. A quiet, disturbing paradox that hints at something deeply, terribly amiss. A mystery so disturbing it would come to inhabit the quiet corners of a small Alabama town, causing its residents to question if they were seeing a miracle or something considerably more malevolent. Before we go on with the tale of Nora Vance, if you happen to be new to this channel, please subscribe and activate notifications, and let us know in the comments which state or country you are listening from. Now, let us make our way into Harwick, Alabama, and into a mystery that not a soul in that town was ever truly ready to confront. Harwick, Alabama, in the year of our Lord, 1871, was not a place of grand declarations or thriving commerce. It was a town still drawing breath, still tending to the profound, suppurating injuries of a conflict that had ripped the nation, and most especially the South, asunder. The very atmosphere appeared to hold the faint, bitter odor of ash and ruin blending with the heavy, sweet fragrance of magnolias and the ever-present dust churned up by wagons on paths not yet paved. The Civil War had concluded 6 years earlier, yet its influence stretched far and cold over Harwick, affecting every family, every acre, every exhausted spirit. The men who had departed in their Confederate gray had come back, if they came back at all, with vacant eyes and haunted silences, their bodies frequently damaged, their spirits permanently scarred. The women, who had sustained the households with diminishing supplies and increasing anxieties, now confronted a future that felt both strange and hopelessly grim. The economy of Harwick, similar to numerous southern towns, was inseparably linked to cotton. Fields extended beneath the harsh Alabama sun, their white bowls a promise of wealth that seldom came to pass for the ordinary farmer. Sharecropping had become the new actuality for many, a pattern of debt and reliance that swapped one form of bondage for another. Just as confining, the freedmen, newly liberated, navigated a hazardous terrain of newfound freedom and firmly rooted bias, their aspirations often crushed against the harsh truths of Reconstruction-era Alabama. Racial tensions smoldered beneath the surface of respectable society, occasionally erupting in acts of silent brutality or open intimidation, a continuous unsettling vibration in the background of day-to-day existence. The town itself was a humble grouping of wooden houses, the majority in some level of decay, their paint flaking like sun-scorched skin. A single, dusty primary street held a general store, its shelves meagerly filled, but its owner, old Mr. Abernathy, forever prepared with a bit of rumor or a compassionate ear. There existed a blacksmith, his hammer sounding a steady clang that broke the stillness of the afternoons, and a small, plain post office, where letters from kin far away were impatiently anticipated, frequently bringing tidings of difficulty instead of good fortune. At the center of Harwick, in both location and spirit, sat the First Baptist Church, its spire extending toward the sky like a desperate supplication. On Sundays, its benches would fill with the town's residents, searching for comfort, direction, and a feeling of togetherness in the passionate sermons of Reverend Tate, whose voice could boom like a summer tempest or calm like a soft breeze, based on the supposed moral failings of his congregation. The roadways were mostly dirt trails, becoming impassable muck during the heavy spring downpours, and hardening into cracked, parched roots in the oppressive summer heat. The noises of Harwick were uncomplicated. The far-off lowing of livestock, the chirping of crickets at nightfall, the occasional whinny of a horse, the murmur of discussions carried on front porches, and the constant hum of insects. The aromas were earthy, damp ground following a rain, wood smoke from cooking fires, the faint cloying sweetness of honeysuckle, and the sharp metallic tang of perspiration from toiling beneath the sun. Life was difficult, inflexible, and profoundly conventional. Transformation came gradually, if at all, and anything unusual was examined, talked over, and frequently dreaded. It was into this world that Elias Vance and his daughter Nora lived. Their dwelling, a two-story farmhouse, sat a mile or so beyond the primary cluster of Harwick, nestled among a small group of ancient oak trees. It had once been an attractive house, constructed with attention and satisfaction. But currently it displayed a layer of faded grey paint and a quiet atmosphere of neglect, as if grieving alongside its inhabitant. Elias Vance was a man forged in the fire of conflict. A previous Confederate officer who had come back from the battlefields of Virginia, a transformed individual. He was tall, lean, with a stern jawline and eyes that seemed continuously shadowed, even in the most brilliant daylight. His hair, once a deep brown, was now laced with early grey, drawn back neatly from a tall forehead. He moved with a stiff, nearly military exactness, his shoulders always squared, his look direct but unwelcoming. In public, Elias was a man of sparse words. He would come to town for supplies, his buggy clattering along the dusty road, and conduct his transactions with a quiet effectiveness that discouraged trivial conversation. He settled his bills promptly, nodded briefly to those he encountered, and gave only the shortest of polite remarks. He was regarded in a distant, cautious manner for his military service, and for his constant stoicism when faced with individual disaster. Everybody knew he had lost his cherished wife, Clara, during the war years, a loss that seemed to have emptied him, leaving merely a casing of the man he had previously been. He was perceived as a man of integrity, if a melancholy one, and his seclusion was ascribed to his sorrow. At home, however, the quiet of the Vance farmhouse was a different kind of creature. It was a stillness born not of serenity, but of an oppressive authority. Elias's routines were careful, nearly ceremonial. He would rise before dawn, look after his modest plot of cotton and corn, and then go back to the house where he would get Nora's breakfast ready. Nora, his sole offspring, was a slight child, petite for her years with fragile features and hair the shade of moonlit strands. Her eyes, however, were her most remarkable feature, a profound, perceptive blue that appeared to contain an age-old knowledge, or maybe an age-old sadness. She moved through the house with an unnerving quietness, her steps hardly detectable on the worn floorboards. Her voice, when she talked, was gentle, nearly a murmur, as if she feared disrupting the fragile calm that Elias so thoroughly upheld. Nora was, by all descriptions, a well-mannered child, excessively well-mannered, some might have murmured, had they dared to articulate their thoughts openly. She was always neatly clothed, her garments plain but clean, her hair always perfectly braided. She spent her days reading the few books Elias possessed, or drawing in a worn notebook, her fragile hands moving with a silent elegance. She seldom played outdoors, and when she did, it was constantly within the limits of the Vance property under the watchful, ever-present gaze of her father. The townsfolk saw her as a quiet, nearly otherworldly child, a fragile blossom in a harsh world. They felt pity for her due to the loss of her mother and for the somber existence she led with her withdrawn father. They perceived her as a child, possibly a little unwell, but otherwise not noteworthy. They did not yet perceive the disturbing truth that was slowly, discreetly starting to show itself, a truth that would fracture the calm exterior of the Vance household and reveal a darkness that no one in Harwick was equipped to grasp. The initial shadow, a slight and nearly invisible disturbance in the smooth surface of Harwick life, started to stretch in the spring of 1875. 4 years had passed since the war's conclusion. 4 years since Nora Vance had last been genuinely regarded as a child of 10. Now, by the calendar, she ought to have been 14, on the verge of womanhood, her body starting to show the subtle changes and contours that signified the shift from girl to young woman. But Nora, to the increasingly observant eye of Mabel Prout, stayed stubbornly, disturbingly the same. Mabel Prout was a woman constructed for watching. Her eyes, though often narrowed in doubt, missed little. She was a regular at the general store, her basket constantly full of the week's essentials, her ears always receptive to the currents of town rumor. She had known Nora Vance since the child was born, had observed her toddle, then walk, then develop into a quiet, pale girl. But something had halted. It was a Tuesday afternoon, hot and damp, the kind of day that rendered the air dense and oppressive, when Mabel noticed Nora in town. Elias Vance had brought her in, as he sometimes did, to collect a new spool of thread or a small envelope of seeds. Nora stood beside her father, a silent, almost see-through figure in a simple calico dress. Her hair, still the shade of moonlight, was braided down her back, and her face, framed by the soft wisps that escaped her braid, was smooth, unlined, and utterly childlike. Mabel watched her, then glanced at her own daughter, Sarah, who was a year younger than Nora. Sarah was all awkward limbs and developing curves, her voice starting to deepen, her face breaking out in the occasional blemish. She was growing, changing, blossoming into adolescence. But Nora was not. Her height appeared unchanged from 2, even 3 years earlier. Her hands were still small, her wrists slender as a bird's bones. Her chest remained flat, her hips narrow. It was as if time, in its endless wisdom, had simply neglected to affect her. Mabel experienced a prickling of unease, a cold sensation that began in her stomach and spread through her veins. It was not merely that Nora appeared young. It was that she appeared precisely the same. The same fragile features, the same wide blue eyes, the same disturbing stillness. It was as if she had been kept like a specimen in a container untouched by the natural progression of years. That evening, as the crickets began their nightly chorus, and the air offered a slight welcome break from the day's heat, Mabel sat on her porch swing, fanning herself with a palmetto fan. Her husband, Thomas, a kind, but frequently unaware man, was whittling a piece of cedar beside her. "Thomas," Mabel started, her voice hushed. "Did you see Nora Vance today?" Thomas grunted, his knife carving a delicate curl from the timber. "Saw her with Elias at the store, quiet as ever." "She's not growing, Thomas," Mabel stated, her voice tight with a certainty that allowed no disagreement. "She's 14 years old, and she looks no older than 10, maybe 11. At a push, Thomas paused, his whittling, looking up at his wife with a furrowed forehead. "Now, Mabel, girls develop at their own speed. Some are late bloomers. You are aware of that. This isn't about late blooming, Thomas," Mabel insisted, her fans stilling. "This is unnatural. I have observed enough children grow up in this town to recognize what's natural and what isn't. Her face, her size, her everything. It's as if she's stuck frozen." Thomas, a pragmatic man, shrugged. "Elias keeps her isolated. Possibly she just isn't receiving enough sunlight or proper nourishment. He's an odd one, that Elias, since Clara passed." Mabel scoffed. "It's beyond that. It's a sensation, Thomas. A cold sensation." The next day, Mabel's unease solidified into certainty. At the dry goods store, while looking at rolls of fabric, she encountered Mrs. Henderson, a woman recognized for her sharp tongue and even sharper observations. "Mabel, have you seen Nora Vance lately?" Mrs. Henderson murmured, leaning in conspiratorially, her eyes flitting around the sparsely filled store. Mabel straightened, a flicker of grim satisfaction in her gaze. "I did just yesterday, and I have been reflecting on it. She hasn't altered a bit, has she?" Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice barely perceptible. "My Martha, she's merely a year older, and she already has suitors showing interest. But Nora, she's still a child. A little doll. A doll that doesn't age," Mabel finished, a shiver running down her spine despite the warmth. "It isn't right, Mrs. Henderson. It simply isn't right." The seed of doubt once planted began to sprout with alarming quickness. The women of Harwick, with their sharp eyes and even sharper ears, began to observe. At church, during the brief moments Nora was present, hushed whispers would spread through the pews. "She's so petite for her age. Looks precisely as she did 3 years ago. Poor child, always so pale." The whispers were not malicious, not yet, but they held an undercurrent of fear of the unknown. Reverend Tate, A man acutely sensitive to the spiritual heartbeat of his congregation could sense the change. He observed the furtive glances toward the Vance pew, the uneasy murmurs. He understood that something was agitating his flock, something that resisted the natural order. And so, the following Sunday, his sermon took on a new, more threatening tone. His voice, usually booming with righteous intensity, began with a low, resonant hum that demanded attention. My brethren, we exist in a world of God's divine order. The seasons turn, the crops grow, the children blossom into men and women, precisely as the Lord intended. But sometimes he paused, his gaze moving across the congregation, resting for a moment perhaps on the quiet, still figure of Nora Vance, though he never identified her. Sometimes the natural order is disrupted. Sometimes things appear that resist explanation, that stand external to the Lord's design. He spoke of the perils of vanity, of attempting to stop the passage of time, of interfering with God's plan. He spoke of blessings and curses, of the mysterious ways the Almighty might decide to show his displeasure or his divine intervention. He did not accuse, not directly, but his words created a vivid image of an irregularity, a deviation that could only be interpreted as either a sign from above or a dark portent. The atmosphere in the church became heavy, dense with unspoken fears. The town, already grappling with the consequences of war and the harsh realities of daily existence, now had a new unsettling mystery to confront. The whispers turned to muted theories, some calling upon witchcraft, others divine retribution. The quiet, pale girl from the Vance farm was no longer just a quiet, pale girl. She was becoming a representation, a question mark, a source of increasing dread in the heart of Harwick. And the shadow, once faint, now extended long and dark across the entire community. Dr. Ambrose Holt was a man of science, a beacon of logic in a town often swayed by superstition and gossip. His office, situated in a small, well-kept building just off the main street, was evidence of his systematic character. Inside the air smelled faintly of carbolic acid and dried botanicals, a combination of modern medicine and traditional remedies. His instruments, though basic by today's standards, were carefully organized. Gleaming scalpels, a polished stethoscope, glass vials filled with various extracts and a microscope, a marvel of technology that enabled him to see into the invisible world of cells and microorganisms. He kept a small leather-bound notebook on his desk, its pages filled with exact observations, diagnoses, and the occasional frustrated inquiry. Dr. Holt had trained in Philadelphia, a city far removed from the dusty paths of Harwick, and had come back to his native Alabama with a firmly established conviction in the strength of observation, logic, and factual proof. He was a quiet man, reflective and methodical, his brow often creased in concentration. He treated all illnesses, from the common cold to the more severe fevers that moved through the town, with the same constant commitment to comprehending the fundamental cause. He was respected, if not always entirely understood, by the townsfolk, who often favored the comforting words of Reverend Tate over the unemotional, hard facts of science. It was in the late summer of 1875, amid the increasing whispers about Nora Vance, that Elias Vance himself sought out Dr. Holt. Elias came to the doctor's office in his typical quiet manner, his face expressionless, his stance unbending. He requested a thorough examination of his daughter, stating with a chilling absence of emotion that the child seems to be developing slowly and there are rumors. It was a preemptive action, a deliberate maneuver to suppress the rising tide of conjecture, to provide a medical justification for what the town saw as an irregularity. Dr. Holt agreed. His professional curiosity was stimulated. He had heard the whispers, naturally, but had dismissed them as the typical small-town gossip, exaggerated and baseless. He anticipated finding a somewhat underdeveloped girl, perhaps experiencing malnutrition or a persistent illness, nothing more. The examination took place a few days later in the quiet, sterile environment of Dr. Holt's office. Nora Vance sat on the examination table, her small feet dangling, her hands folded in her lap. She was, as always, disturbingly still, her blue eyes following Dr. Holt's movements with an intelligent, almost knowing gaze. Elias stood in the corner of the room, a silent guardian, his presence a heavy pressure in the small space. Dr. Holt started his examination systematically. He measured her height, a mere 4 feet 8 inches, a stature more fitting for a girl of 10 or 11. He weighed her, a featherlight 75 pounds. He observed the fine, almost translucent quality of her skin, the lack of any adolescent blemishes. He checked her teeth, noting their small size, the absence of wisdom teeth, and the general appearance of a younger set of teeth. He felt her bones, sensing the delicate structure of her wrists, her ankles, her ribs. There was no sign of the vigorous growth spurts typical of a girl her age. He then moved to more private observations, his professional demeanor hiding a growing sense of unease. He observed the complete lack of secondary sexual characteristics. Her chest was flat, her hips narrow, her body utterly without the subtle curves that indicated the beginning of puberty. Her voice, when she answered his questions about her general health, "Do you feel tired, Nora? Do you have any pains?" was gentle, high-pitched, and childlike. She reported no menstrual cycles, no bodily changes whatsoever. Dr. Holt's brow creased deeper with each observation. He questioned Elias about Nora's eating habits, her daily routines, her general health background. Elias gave precise, almost memorized answers: a balanced diet, regular sleep, no significant illnesses since childhood. He spoke of Nora's quiet temperament, her love for reading, her fragile constitution. As the examination ended, Dr. Holt found himself in a state of deep confusion. Medically, Nora Vance appeared as a girl of 10 or 11, perhaps 12 at the very oldest. Yet, Elias had stated definitively that she was 14. The discrepancy was clear, undeniable. It contradicted every medical textbook, every physiological comprehension of human development. He made his notes in his journal that evening, his typically neat handwriting showing a slight tremor. Patient Nora Vance, age 14 years, per father Elias Vance. Apparent age 10, 11 years. Height 4 feet 8 inches. Weight 75 pounds. Skin fine, pale, no adolescent changes. Dentition consistent with younger age. Secondary sexual characteristics absent. General health appears delicate but no overt signs of illness. No reported menstrual cycles. Observations: developmental arrest. Cause unknown. No obvious pathology. Patient is quiet, compliant, intelligent. Gaze. Father Elias Vance present throughout. Demeanor controlled, precise, almost detached. An unsettling case requires further observation, a profound anomaly. The uneasy feeling he could not shake was not just professional frustration. It was a deeper, more basic sense that something was deeply wrong, something that went beyond mere medical puzzle. It was the sensation of looking at a puzzle with missing parts, but knowing with a chilling certainty that those pieces had not simply been misplaced, but purposely taken away. The rationalist in him struggled to reconcile the facts with the unexplainable. The man in him felt a cold dread start to settle in his bones. A premonition of a darkness he was only just starting to perceive. To comprehend the chilling depths of Elias Vance's deeds, one must first explore the shadows of his history, into the furnace of sorrow and loss that had twisted his very spirit. Before the conflict, Elias had been a different man. A proud property owner, a dedicated spouse, a man whose stern exterior softened significantly in the company of his cherished wife, Clara. Clara Vance was, by all descriptions, a woman of ethereal beauty and gentle spirit. Her hair was the shade of spun moonlight. Her eyes a deep perceptive blue, and her laughter, though uncommon, was said to be like the chiming of tiny bells. She was the brightness of Elias's life, the foundation that held him steady in a world that could often feel disordered. Nora, their sole child, was born in 1861, just as the first stirrings of war started to shake the foundations of the nation. From the instant she was born, Nora was Clara's mirror image. As she grew, the similarity became remarkable. The same fragile features, the same luminous hair, the same penetrating blue eyes. It was a source of immense happiness for Elias, a living proof of his love for Clara. Then came the war. Elias, a man of duty and principle, answered the summons to arms, abandoning his young wife and infant daughter. He marched with the Confederate forces, experiencing the brutal campaigns, the endless marches, the horrifying slaughter of battles that turned fields into burial grounds. He witnessed unspeakable acts, saw men he knew and esteemed fall, felt the cold hold of fear and hopelessness. The conflict stripped him of his innocence, his hopefulness, and slowly, inexorably, began to erode his humanity. He came back from the war in 1865, not with a hero's welcome, but to a quiet that was far more devastating than any battlefield uproar. Clara had passed away in 1863 while Elias was still fighting in Virginia. Not by bullet or cannon, but by the insidious hold of consumption, a sickness that plagued innumerable homes during those lean years. She had faded away, leaving behind a grieving community and a bewildered 2-year-old Nora. Elias returned to an vacant house, a ghost of the home he had left. The light had gone out of his existence, leaving him adrift in a sea of deep, inconsolable sorrow. In the sitting room of the Vance farmhouse, above the cold, unused fireplace, hung a large, exquisitely painted portrait of Clara. It showed her as she was at the age of 14, a young woman on the edge of adulthood, her beauty radiant, her eyes full of youthful hope. It was a portrait Elias would gaze at for hours, his look fixed on the image of his lost love, a silent communion with a past that could never be recovered. And as Nora grew, the likeness to that portrait became nearly unbearable for Elias. At 10, then 11, then 12, Nora was the living representation of his lost Clara, a precious, fragile reflection. It was a similarity that for Elias became both a comfort and a torment, a constant reminder of what he had lost, and a desperate, growing wish to hold on to the only part of her that remained. The first subtle hints that something calculated, something deeply unnatural was happening, began to surface in the fragmented memories of those who had once been close to the Vance household. Old Mr. Abernathy, the general store proprietor, a man whose memory was as long as his beard, recalled seeing Elias Vance at unusual hours, not in town, but down by the stream that wound through the woods bordering his property. Elias would be carrying a small woven container, his head bent, his movements secretive. He seemed to be collecting something, not berries or mushrooms, but small unremarkable plants, their leaves a dull green, their stems thin and wiry. Mr. Abernathy had thought nothing of it at the time, assuming Elias was collecting herbs for some household remedy, a common practice in those days. But the memory once stirred by the whispers about Nora now took on a more ominous shade. Then there was Clem Dudley, a burly, reserved man who had worked as a farmhand on the Vance property for a few years after the war before relocating to find better wages. Clem, a man not easily disturbed, remembered a strange, bitter odor that would occasionally come from the Vance kitchen. It wasn't the smell of cooking or of cleaning solutions. It was an earthy, sharp scent, almost medicinal, but with an underlying bitterness that made his nose wrinkle. He had observed Elias in the kitchen, bent over a mortar and pestle, grinding something into a fine paste. Elias would always stop when Clem entered, his back stiffening, his movements becoming deliberately casual. Clem had dismissed it as Elias's peculiarities, another aspect of the man's grief-stricken isolation. But the memory of that smell, that secretive grinding, now felt like a cold lump in his stomach. And then there was Nora herself. Her persistent tiredness, her disturbing pallor, the way her delicate skin seemed almost see-through. She was always quiet, always obedient, never complaining. Even when Elias insisted she consume a particular herbal tea each morning or take a spoonful of a thick dark paste with her meals, Elias would watch her, his eyes intense, unwavering as she swallowed the mixture without objection. He would tell her it was for her health to keep her strong to ward off the illnesses that had taken her mother. And Nora, innocent and trusting, would obey. She was a child after all, and her father was her whole world, her sole guardian in a world that had taken everything else from her. The pieces were present, scattered like fallen leaves, waiting for someone with the intelligence and the bravery to gather them, to put together the horrifying picture of Elias Vance's distorted devotion. If this narrative is already unsettling you, good, because what Dr. Holt was about to discover would test everything he believed about medicine, about fathers, and about love. Hit that like button to assist more people find this story, and let's continue. The summer of 1879 brought with it not only the oppressive heat of Alabama, but also a new unsettling tremor through the quiet rhythms of Harwick. Thomas Grier, a young man of 19, was a familiar and well-regarded figure in town. He was the son of the local blacksmith, a robust lad with a ready smile, a shock of unruly brown hair, and a natural charm that drew people to him. Thomas was full of the boundless energy of youth, keen to make his impression on the world, and like many young men his age, his thoughts were starting to turn towards matters of the heart. His focus, to the surprise of many, had settled upon Nora Vance. It wasn't her liveliness that drew him, for Nora possessed little of that. Instead, it was her quiet enigma, her ethereal beauty, and the profound sadness that seemed to live in her deep blue eyes. He saw her as a fragile blossom, requiring protection, and perhaps a bit of brightness. He had first truly observed her at the annual church picnic, an uncommon occasion when Elias permitted Nora to venture beyond the limits of their property. Nora, then by the calendar 18 years old, still appeared no older than a child of 12. But Thomas, with the romantic optimism of youth, saw beyond the physical irregularity. He perceived her gentle spirit, her quiet intelligence, and the haunting beauty that reminded him of a porcelain figurine. Their meetings were short, secretive, and charged with the unspoken tension of a forbidden attraction. Thomas would find excuses to linger at the general store when he knew Elias and Nora might be present. He would offer a polite nod to Elias, then a shy, hopeful smile to Nora. Nora, in turn, would give a faint, almost unnoticeable smile back, a fleeting warmth in her usually still features. Once he managed to drop a small, brightly colored ribbon near her feet, pretending it was an accident. Nora picked it up, her delicate fingers brushing his as she gave it back. And for a moment their eyes met, a silent communication passing between them. Another time he saw her drawing by the stream, an uncommon moment of solitude for her. He approached carefully, offering a few wild daisies he had picked. Nora accepted them, her cheeks flushing a faint pink, and for a few precious minutes they spoke, their voices low, almost secretive. Thomas spoke of his aspirations of growing his father's smithy, of seeing the world beyond Harwick. Nora, in her soft, whispery voice, spoke of the books she read, of the tales she imagined. These innocent meetings, however, did not escape the notice of Elias Vance. His possessiveness of Nora had grown over the years, solidifying into an impenetrable barrier. He saw every glance, every whispered word, every fleeting smile as a danger to the carefully built world he had created around his daughter. He saw Thomas Grier not as a hopeful admirer, but as a hunter, a force that threatened to take away the last trace of Clara that he clung to so desperately. One sweltering afternoon, Elias witnessed Thomas speaking to Nora outside the general store, a small bunch of wild flowers in Thomas's hand. The scene, innocent as it was, ignited a cold fury in Elias. His face, usually expressionless, twisted into a mask of barely restrained anger. He strode towards them, his movement stiff and purposeful, his eyes fixed on Thomas with an intensity that made the young man recoil. "Nora." Elias's voice was low, dangerously composed. "We are going." He did not acknowledge Thomas, did not even look at him. He simply took Nora's arm, his hold firm, and guided her away, leaving Thomas standing alone, the wild flowers still held in his hand, a knot of fear tightening in his stomach. The public display, though short, was sufficient to send a ripple of discomfort through the few townsfolk who saw it. Elias Vance's possessiveness was well known, but this was something darker, more threatening. Then Thomas Grier vanished. It was a Sunday evening, a week after the incident at the general store. Thomas had informed his parents he was going for a walk, perhaps to clear his head, perhaps to try and get a glimpse of Nora. He was last observed by old Mr. Abernathy walking down the dusty road that led towards the Vance property. the setting sun casting long shadows ahead of him. He never came back. The alarm was raised the next morning. Thomas's parents, frantic with worry, alerted Deputy Orrin Falk. Deputy Falk was a man of quiet capability, his uniform often dusty, his face weathered by the sun. He was a good man, dedicated to his duty. But the disappearance of a young man without a trace was an uncommon and deeply unsettling event in Harwich. Deputy Falk initiated an immediate investigation. He organized search parties, searching the woods and fields around Harwich, calling out Thomas's name until their voices were raspy. He questioned everyone who had seen Thomas that evening, carefully writing down every detail. He spoke to Mr. Abernathy, who confirmed seeing Thomas heading towards the Vance farm. Naturally, Deputy Falk went to the Vance property. He found Elias Vance on his porch calmly whittling a piece of timber. Nora seated quietly beside him reading. Elias greeted the deputy with his usual reserved politeness. When questioned about Thomas, Elias's face remained expressionless. "I saw no one, Deputy. Nora and I were at home all evening. We keep to ourselves." Nora, when asked, simply nodded, her eyes downcast, her voice a barely audible whisper. "I saw no one, sir." Deputy Falk searched the Vance property with Elias's reluctant consent. He found nothing. No sign of a struggle, no abandoned items, no recently turned soil. The farmhouse and its surrounding land were carefully maintained, almost unnaturally so. The deputy left frustrated and deeply uneasy. Elias Vance was an odd man, but there was no proof, no evidence to connect him to Thomas's disappearance. The community's fear escalated significantly. The whispers about Nora now mingled with terrified speculation about Thomas. Had he run away? Had he encountered an accident? Or had something far more sinister occurred? The quiet, reclusive Elias Vance, once merely an object of pity and distant regard, now became a figure of dark suspicion. His unyielding control over Nora, his cold manner, his unwavering denial, all added to a growing sense of dread that settled over Harwich like a shroud. Dr. Holt, meanwhile, felt a cold knot of certainty tighten in his stomach. Thomas Greer's disappearance, combined with his own unsettling observations of Nora Vance, strengthened his growing suspicion about Elias. The medical anomaly, once a confusing puzzle, now felt inextricably connected to a potential crime. The pieces were starting to come together, forming a picture far more horrifying than he had ever imagined. He knew with a chilling certainty that he had to investigate further to uncover the truth, no matter how dark or devastating it might be. The fate of Nora Vance and perhaps Thomas Greer depended on it. The disappearance of Thomas Greer, combined with his own profound medical confusion regarding Nora Vance, propelled Dr. Holt into a systematic and relentless investigation. The rationalist in him demanded explanations, and the humanitarian in him felt a growing urgency to safeguard Nora from whatever dark secret Elias Vance harbored. His office, usually a place of healing, changed into a quiet laboratory of inquiry. He spent his evenings studying medical texts, botanical guides, and any scientific journals he could obtain, searching for any unusual condition, any rare plant, any forgotten folk remedy that might explain Nora's halted development. His search was meticulous, often frustrating. The medical knowledge of the late 19th century, while advancing rapidly, still had extensive, uncharted territories. He considered everything. Uncommon genetic conditions, chronic illnesses, even the possibility of some exotic poison, but nothing quite matched. Nora showed no other indications of severe illness, only the profound and unsettling lack of physical maturation. Then a thought struck him. What if it wasn't a sickness, but a deliberate interference? What if Elias Vance, in his twisted sorrow, was actively doing something to Nora? He recalled the old wives' tales, the folk remedies passed down through generations, some of which involved plants with strong, if poorly understood, effects on the human body. He decided to broaden his search, beyond the boundaries of conventional medicine. He wrote a careful letter, his handwriting exact and clear, to Dr. Leonard Price, a renowned botanist at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. In the letter, Dr. Holt described Nora's case in thorough detail. Her apparent age compared to her chronological age, the complete lack of secondary sexual characteristics, her pallor, her quiet manner, and the absence of any other obvious disease symptoms. He then posed a series of questions asking if Dr. Price knew of any plants native to Alabama or the wider South that were known to have effects on human growth, development, or hormonal systems, particularly those that might suppress puberty or cause a stunting of physical maturation. He highlighted the unusual nature of the case, hinting at a possible deliberate administration. The weeks that followed were agonizing. Dr. Holt continued his daily visits, treating his patients, but his mind was constantly replaying Nora's image, Elias's cold manner, and the chilling mystery of Thomas Greer's disappearance. He felt a growing sense of isolation, burdened by a secret he could not yet fully express, a suspicion that felt both monstrous and terrifyingly believable. Finally, a letter arrived from Tuscaloosa, its envelope bearing the university's stamp. Dr. Holt tore it open with trembling hands. Dr. Price's reply was detailed, academic, and utterly devastating. Dr. Price acknowledged the unusual nature of the case, and after careful thought, suggested a particular plant, Lithospermum ruderale, commonly known as stoneseed or wayside gramwell. He explained that while its properties were not fully understood by Western medicine, it had a long and recorded history of use among various indigenous peoples of North America, particularly for its effects on fertility. He wrote of tribal women using infusions of the plant to suppress menstruation and prevent conception, and of its use in some cultures to delay puberty in young girls or even to cause a state of extended childhood. Dr. Price went on to explain that recent, albeit limited, scientific investigations into Lithospermum ruderale had begun to identify certain alkaloids within the plant that were believed to interfere with the pituitary gland and consequently the thyroid gland. He described how a suppressed thyroid could cause a host of symptoms: stunted growth, delayed sexual development, lethargy, pallor, and a general slowing of metabolic processes. He noted that prolonged exposure, especially during critical developmental periods, could have profound and potentially permanent effects on an individual's physical maturation. The plant, he added, was relatively common in the region, often found growing in dry open woodlands and along creek beds. Dr. Holt read the letter once, then a second time, his hands gripping the paper so tightly his knuckles turned white. The words on the page were a cold, hard scientific explanation for the unnatural phenomenon he had witnessed. Every symptom Nora showed, her small stature, her lack of secondary sexual characteristics, her pallor, her quiet, almost listless manner, suddenly made horrifying sense. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. Elias Vance wasn't just a grieving father. He was a deliberate creator of his daughter's halted development.